crack in then with today's lesson. Right, so this week then we're going to be carrying on with the creepy crawlies and the bugs. Last week we went straight into it with some pencil drawings, and I also showed you the embossing tool for doing the small highlights, or you could use something else. So basically you indent the surface of the paper, and hang on a minute. So you indent the surface of the paper, and then what happens is when you shade over the top with a pencil, you're left with all these small highlights and things, which there were quite a few of on the backs and the abdomens and the thorax of the different bugs that we were looking at. So the idea of what we're doing is to put several of these different insects together to create a composition or an arrangement of bugs sort of crawling over each other. It could be butterflies or moths and things as well. So we're going to continue with that today. And if you got the email or read the website, I asked you to bring a roller ball and a biro pen, which we're going to be using today. So we're going to look at some techniques very briefly for those that would like to look at that sort of thing. And then we're going to use the grid again, but position the grid slightly differently so we can underlap or overlap the one. Well, it'll be underlapping the bug that we did last week, or the insect that we did last week. So we're kind of creating a mixed media piece using this. Now next week I intend to use a little bit of watercolor as a background, and then also on top of that using color pencils. So next week you'll be needing those things. If you haven't got any watercolors, then an ink or something like that, or even paint to create a little bit of a color underneath to then work over the top of will be good. And we'll be putting that insect onto the picture or onto the composition that we've been working on so far. So we'll go over and have a look at the wall. So these are the lovely, beautiful little insects that we were looking at last time, and so I was drawing that black beetle just here in the middle. This week I've got a completely different one that I'm doing, so I'm going to be putting these together. As I said to you, all of these insects and things are on the website, you can get a link to the website or on the email and go and find those to have a look at. So this is the kind of thing that I was hoping that we could all do. Obviously these ones are all colour, and we're doing something slightly different, as in we're adding mixed media to them. All of these insects actually fit within the picture frame on here, but you can make the insects go off of the picture, out of the picture frame as well. And that just makes it a little bit more interesting, as in it suggests that there's more to the space that they're in. So they're kind of going out of the picture frame into the real, or into another world, if you like. So we'll be adding a little bit of colour, getting stuck in with the colour next week. This week we're still sticking with black and white and the pens. Now I showed you last week Rosalind Monk's, I think it was, that just popped up a second ago. Rosalind Monk's puts all of these patterns and things on these shapes of insects, which I thought was quite interesting. And indeed, if you wanted to try playing around with a few ideas like that on the insects you're doing tonight, that's great. But I'm going to be trying to use the pens to do a kind of a detailed copy of one of the photographs that we've been using previously. There was also Chris Marley, who I showed you a video of last week, who arranges real insects into kind of a picture frame. He was from the fashion industry as well. And then we had some very detailed drawings. So this kind of goes a little bit alongside what I'm aiming for next week, is to have a look at doing some colour work with colour pencils. So now this artist just here is Alex Conahin, and Alex Conahin uses these like floral architectural features to make up the insects, and they're all in again in pen, but there's lots of detail in there, as you can see, but there's very strong contrasty areas, and if we zoom right into it, you can see that there's hatching and cross hatching, and then there's darker, thicker lines as well as the thinner lines on the edge of things, and there's this element of pattern in there. All right, so I'm quite inspired by this sort of thing, so I may kind of introduce some of these ideas a little bit later on, but I keep finding these things and want to show you all, so there you go. Now I have got a little video on him which I could show you how he creates the work. It's quite interesting. He starts off working on the whole of the butterfly or the bug or insect, and does these really dark areas first, and then goes in with some of the other details afterwards. So let's turn that off. Sorry, my screen keeps going blank. And so here's a few of the insects that I showed you last week. Some of these are also on the drive, so you can have a look at some of those in more detail if you want. I'm going to show you now the kind of thing that I'm planning to do by taking you over to the desk. Okay, so this is the insect that we did last week, and if you remember, we used this grid just here. We placed the grid where we wanted the insect to go, put dots around the edges, made the grid as I explained before, drew it in lightly with a pencil, and then did the same thing over the top of the insect. As long as you've got the same amount of squares, if the squares are slightly out, it doesn't matter too much. And then, if you remember correctly, we went around the outside, or suggested going around the silhouette or the shapes of the insect, so that then you don't have to think anymore about the proportions, because you know you've got them pretty close. And as I always say, you can change these things as you go along. So the thing then that I did during the process of doing this was I added some of these very tiny highlights in there using the embossing tool that I brought along. This is a different one here. I got these from Amazon, and they were only, I think they were something like £4 for 6 or something, and they all come in different sizes, but you can use them for things like twilling and paper craft and all this sort of thing. So they're quite useful things. But as you remember, I embossed the surface by drawing into the surface, doing stipples, and then shading back over the surface, so the indented bit doesn't get shaded, and you end up with these really detailed highlights that are quite difficult to get if you're just trying to do it like by going around each single one of them. All right, now if I zoom out, I'll show you what we're going to be attempting to do next. So here is bug number 2, and you can see him on screen just over here. Now this one has got all this lovely blue colour all over him. And look at that detail. It's a fantastic photograph, all found from the old internet just there. Now what I did is I turned this insect into a black and white photo. Now you can do this sort of thing easily on like a phone or something like that. If you go into the editing mode on your phone, you can just turn the whole picture into a black and white image if it helps you to draw it. So having turned it into black and white, you start to notice a little bit more of the texture and detail in there, and also where the tone is. So there's a bit more tone towards the top of his wings, where it joins on to the thorax, I think it is. So it helps you get into the detail, and indeed I'm hoping it's going to help me when drawing in pen as well. Okay, so I've got a couple of techniques. So if you're new to using pen, which I know one or two of you are, perhaps not used pen very much, this kind of thing, these sorts of techniques are quite useful to practice. Now The reason it's in a circle is because then we can start to see how perhaps a three-dimensional effect might work. So the one or in the center row to the very right, you can see the curves going around the sphere, which helps to make it look 3D. The one at the bottom on the right, next to the one with the scaly texture, you can see the little circles get smaller and smaller, which creates tone. So making the marks smaller and more dense can also create a really nice tonal effect on there. And there's other things on there too. I'll show you another one just over here. So this one I think was probably done on a PC or a computer, because it's quite, well, maybe not actually, could have been done, but we can see a few different techniques. So you've got contour. You can see the lines are curving around the shape of the object. And if we think about the insects, you could start using cross-hatching and contour lines to start showing the curve and the shape of your insect as well. And then there's things like this down here, stippling. So really close, detailed stippling look goes very well with the insect over here, the insect's back. So you can see the insect's back with all those little tiny stipples on the back. That's the technique that we could use to help show that. And when you want it darker, you add more of the dots. Obviously more of a time-consuming technique, but quite a good one when you really need to get some of that texture forward. And then some of my favourite ones are, it's called doodles on here, but I call it's also known as scumbling. So it's like doing a little scribble. So I'll do a couple of those on the insect itself now, so that we can start to see how some of those might start to work. Okay, so and if you want technique sheets like this, there's absolutely loads of them on the internet. I have posted one or two into the drive, so and I think we looked at one last week as well. So do just type it in, because there are unbelievably loads of these things that you can look at. But when you start combining them and putting them onto your own drawing, that's when things start to get interesting, because you start to think, well, what if I just add cross-hatching and stippling together, for example? So you start combining these things and they start getting really interesting. Okay, so I'm going to zoom in a little bit. So on this, you can see the squares go in a different direction. So basically I've taken insect number 2, the blue insect we'll call him, and I've just moved the grid from this position to this position. So basically that would be the bug with the grid on it shifted over. And one thing I wanted to do is make him look like he's just going underneath the last one. And we called the last insect Prince Sebastian III UK, didn't we? So it's underneath the antler, or whatever you call it, the pincers. Again, need to find out the name of those. And then what you do is you start to apply, you then get the silhouette and the basic shapes. Now on this drawing in particular, I haven't gone into absolute minute detail with my drawing. I just wanted the shapes, because the idea is that I'm going to use the pen to help me create the texture and the detail and the exact shapes and things like that. So I'm going to do a little bit just on his back, so if I can just move that around a little bit. We'll get rid of these pictures if we can, just for a second. I'll leave that one there, put them up there nice and small. So now I always start off with great intentions to do loads of stippling, so I might start like this, but I find that I often lose patience, or I want to work a bit quicker. So I could do, and if you remember that technique, the scumble or the doodle as it was called, I'm doing a really small sort of doodle or scribble on here to start getting some of that texture. So you'll find that as you go, you want some areas to be lighter than others, so do less of the scribble. So here, look, as I said earlier, it's quite dark on his back. I'm going to do less as I go this way, and you then end up creating some tonal range, so from dark to light. Now this that I'm using here right now is a rollerball pen. Rollerballs are really nice because they create such a nice, precise, clean black mark on them, and so they stand out really well. They're very graphic-y, if you like, if you use them like that. So I quite like them. Now the difference between that, as many of you already know, this is a biro pen, and with a biro pen you can do much subtler shading. So if I start quite with very fine lines on here, and you'll notice I'm doing a very different technique now. I'm using cross hatching, so really fine cross hatching, and you can do it very smooth if you want to. In fact, if you just stroke the surface, you'll find that you get a really nice soft mark. Now, earlier on I said that the mark making that you do gets interesting when you start layering the different techniques on top of each other. So I've now added a bit of tone. You can see how lovely and subtle it is. It can be almost as subtle as using a pencil. Now once I've done that, I'll just do a bit more. So satisfying. Once I've done that, I could say, oh right, I want a bit more texture, so I could then start putting in some of these lovely scribbly lines that we were talking about a minute ago. And build it up like that. Now the other thing I forgot about was that you can also use a white pen to add highlights to that, and I didn't ask anyone to bring a white pen. I was just thinking in terms of black and white, but that's maybe something we could touch on next time. So we've got texture and shadow, and you can do it the other way around, of course. So over here, look, I can hatch over the top of my scumbling, prefer scumbling, and add a bit of tone on top of that, and that itself would be quite subtle, but it does have an effect in the long run over how your drawing is going to look. You may find that you prefer using one material, one pen over the other, but do try to mix things up a little bit, because you never know what you can discover by doing these different things. There we go. Okay. So, and then of course you could bring in the dots as well over the top of that. So if I move up, say, to this eye area over here, often the eyes on insects have got that kind of cross-hatched sort of look, like a pattern. Not so much on this one, but I'm going to do it anyway. So lots of very fine hatching. So I'm hatching one way, and then in some areas just putting some cross hatching over to vary the tone, and then some stipples alongside that as well. And he's got a little dark bit just in there as well there. So I'm going to do that, and then I'll bring a little bit of biro back in the top. So it's an exercise again in mark making and technique to show texture and detail in your ugly bug insect. Right, okay, now the next thing I want to show you before I stop talking is this pen here. Now this is something else I haven't mentioned yet, but I'm going to mention it now. So they're called calligraphy pens or brush pens. So they've got on the end, the point is softer, almost like a brush, and you can draw some really lovely lines with them that can vary in thickness. So they're quite nice to experiment with as well, like that. And I've also got one of these. This is from a set of pens called Artesia brushes, and these are like ink pens. And the nice thing about these is you can add some water to them, and they'll go all running. We've got another pen which is a lot less expensive than these, but look, they're brush pens as well, so you can do quite rough marks and very thin lines as well. And then if we add a brush and a bit of water like this, you can make them run, and so they turn into an ink. Now there's another pen which we have used before, and you'll remember these from a few lessons ago if you've been coming a little while. So we've got these ones which are called beryl pens, and these really run when you add water to them. They're brilliant to use. So if you draw with those, you can add tone again by adding a little bit of water to them, and it turns it turns it all into ink. So my thinking is, if you've got a pen that will respond well with water, and the rollerball does do that a little bit. Let's just try the rollerball. So there's the rollerball. Because it's wet ink coming out of there, it does respond a little bit to water. So here we go. It comes out a little bit pinky actually, but look, if you've got a rollerball, then you should be able to add some tone. Now one of the reasons I was showing you that is because when it comes to adding some shadow to your insect, we can say go around the edge, and I suggest you could do it either way around. I'm going to do it whenever I feel like it, and this you can add some shadow to one side of your insect. So if I add water here, I can start to add some shadow, because these insects, they're kind of there's no shadow on them really, because they've been photographed in a studio setting with perhaps a light box behind them, so that you really see the insect and you don't get any shadow. So we could add some shadow to the insect to make him stand out a little bit later as well. Alright, so that's what I thought we would try. So if you've only got the rollerball and the pen, that is absolutely perfect, because that's what I said to bring along. But if you do happen to have some different pens, even if they're not the ones I've mentioned, then try adding a little bit of water and see what happens. You'll find that the biros don't respond very well. They might respond a little bit, but the rollerball does. And if you were in class a few times ago, these Beryl handwriting pens are absolutely brilliant for turning a pen ink into ink that you can paint with. Okay, all right. So We spend the rest of the lesson then working with layering different mark making techniques on top of each other to create the texture of these amazing insects that we've been looking at over the last 2 weeks. So you'll need a rollable pen and perhaps a biro, but as I just mentioned, try out a few different pens and see how they react with other pens, but also with water and so forth. So we're aiming to create something with lots, 2 or 3 probably insects overlapping each other, a little bit like on the illustration that I just showed you. So you can see me here working in to the legs here with obviously a biro pen. You can get really fantastic results with a biro pen. You can get nice soft shading and marks, very subtle shading with a pen. You can also get plenty of mark making, like you see I'm adding all this stippling and dashing over the top of the head just here, whilst also thinking about the tone and shadow that we get on that part of the front there, the head area too. And then there's stippling and dashing going on. So I'm creating these marks here, and then what I'm doing after that is I'll be shading back over the top and adding some more tone onto these areas as well. And you can see some of the biro marks up on the top there that I've done previously. So this is just literally stroking the surface of the paper to get these very fine, very thin and very subtle marks. You see I'm just experimenting with a few different pens here. So at the moment I've got the rollable, but a few minutes ago I happened to have that beryl pen in my hand as well. Sometimes I kind of forget which pen I'm using, so it's not always purposeful, but most of the time I switch over to the rollable pen when I want some more crisp sort of marks on the drawing there, and then obviously I can combine it with the softer marks of the biro. And you'll see in the demonstration earlier that I did sort of a bit of stippling, and then I used some scumbling back over the top, but very tight, small scumbling. One of the pens that I mentioned earlier was the Arteza pen, and I do sort of go in and use a little bit of that a little bit later on to get some thicker and more varied mark making. But generally I'm sticking, as mentioned before, with the rollable and the biro. On that part of the leg just there, I was doing the contouring marks to show the shape of the leg. And when I was doing these antennae, I noticed that mainly the center of the antennae was shaded, so the size of it was dark, which indicates perhaps that there's light coming from either side, or even just from underneath the antler, or that perhaps they were quite thin, and the soft texture created that shadow in the center of the antler. But the interesting thing is, you know, you can add a lot of contrast on things like those legs, because there is very strong highlights and very strong contrasting shadows. So it's quite nice to explore that and just see how things start to look three-dimensional, as you can see on the legs with the highlights and on the antlers and so forth. I call them antlers, they're antennae. Next week we'll be using a bit of watercolour and pencil, as I've mentioned before. A little bit later on in this video I do start to shade in or add watercolour to the background, just to start preparing for that. This was an idea that I had earlier as well, where you can shade back over with your biro and over an embossed area to create a little bit more texture, and this is how it worked with the pencil. So I was just doing a similar thing with the pen just there. I don't really use it on
In fact, I don't use it at all on the bug, but it's certainly another technique that could be explored a little bit further in the future. So working down the bug a little bit further now, I changed the marks again as I moved down the back of the wings or the shell. So instead of doing dots or scumbling, I'm doing like these kind of very small circular marks to get this kind of pocked look on the surface of the shell. You can see me just doing those down there, and again, as I mentioned before, once I put those marks on, I could then start hatching back over it. Here we go with the biro to add a little bit more tone. You can see on the mini photo up there in the corner how it's darker at the top and gets lighter as it comes towards the back, where the light is actually coming around the bug. I suspect that these bugs have all been put onto like a light box or something before being photographed, which is why you've got this really nice effect, contrasty, well lit image. There's probably a light from above as well, but yeah, it looks very effective and very good for drawing detail, those photographs. So there you can see the texture on there. I'm just adding that tone, referring back to the photograph. It's really important that you keep looking back at the subject that you're doing. It's very tempting sometimes once you've got a technique or you've got an idea about how something should look, you forget about looking at the picture as well. So make sure you keep looking back as well. So obviously in this lesson I spent a couple of hours working on the drawing. So it may take you a bit longer depending on how far you want to go with the detail. I wanted to make sure I got through this drawing in this session. But you know, if you really hone in on some of that detail, you can obviously spend a lot longer working into it. So there you go. I'm using a soft putty rubber to remove a lot of the squares and things that are in the background, and at this point I decided that I was going to add a little bit of colour in the background in preparation for next week when we use colour pencils. So this is just watercolour with water applied on the paper. Remember, this is cartridge paper, so I can't overwork the paper too much because it'll start to eat away the paper. So it's important just to add enough water and work on it for a certain amount of time. But when you put the pigment down, if there's enough water there, it will just kind of blend on its own, enough for you to have a background to work over for next week. That said, you don't need to have that all done before next week. We can do it in the lesson as well, and you can dry it quite quickly with a hairdryer or put it on a heater for a few seconds and it will dry. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed looking at pen drawing. Have fun exploring it, and I'll catch you all very soon in the next lesson, which is lesson 3, using colour pencils on our bug compositions. Have a good week.